Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Sultana Crescent by Wiliam F. Vassall. First published in Detective Story magazine, March 5, 1916. The final strains of the enchanting waltz died away, and Richard Delancey led out upon the white deck of the liner his partner of the last dance. "Isn't it lovely?" she asked, her entire soul bubbling over with the exhilaration of youth, of happiness, of life itself. "Entrancing," he replied, with a broad A. "The music, the dancing, the night. It's worth living for." She hardly heard him. Her eyes were lost, away in the dim distance, where the cold moonlight fell on the sparkling water, calm as a mill pond, save only where the sharp prow of the Almirante parted it, as she drove steadily forward. Delancey's palm involuntarily pressed lighter upon the slender fingers of the girl. "Will this ever happen again?" he asked soulfully. "Shall we ever meet again under these charming conditions?" The jarring cockneyism of the man abruptly awakened the girl out of her reverie. She gazed up into his face with her large brown eyes, her lips parted, her breast heaving intoxicatingly, and her round, graceful throat fluttering above the costly clasp of scintillating gems that gathered together in one duster the rich draperies that clothed her superb form. For one instant, their eyes met, and it was not the girl's that wilted under the emotion of contact. "What do you mean?" she asked. "It all comes like a great, grand dream," he said slowly. "It cannot last. I know I shall soon wake up." "You needn't if you don't want to," she replied. "The climate, they tell me, is the same ale the year round, and the great ballroom at the Constant Spring rivals the Ritz or the Cecil." "I know," he replied. "I have experienced the delights of both. But you will not always be there." "Oh," she said coldly. "I did not understand." A deep silence followed, and the water lapped the side of the ship as she slowed down, nearing shore, dazzling for 5 seconds, then lost for 5 more, alluringly intermittent. The glowing tower of Plum Point Lighthouse beckoned invitingly from the far northwest. The lights of Kingston were not yet visible, but along the distant horizon, clear-cut by the light of the moon, shot through the limpid, translucent atmosphere. A few straggling lights flickered like stars lost in a wilderness. Delancey's eyes took in all this before they again rested on the girl at his side. "Miss Ransom," he said, "there is so much I would like to tell you, yet I feel that I ought not, at least not now. It would not be fair to you or to me. But there is one thing I should tell you about myself, and by Jove I will, though I had resolved to keep it a secret." She stirred uneasily. "Don't feel yourself constrained to do anything of the sort, Mr. Delancey. I never try to learn my friends' secrets, and what is more, I never promise to keep them." "I shall not ask you to," Delancey answered. "And it shan't be anything so very horrid either. You needn't look quite so alarmed. I am not going to tell you that I am an escaped convict, or a bank robber, partly because you mightn't believe me, and, partly because you might." The girl laughed sweetly. "Are you looking for some excuse, Mr. Delancey, to tell me that you are a Russian Grand Duke or an Austrian Count? I assure you I shall not stand for it, unless it is some name that I can pronounce without sneezing." It was his turn to laugh now. "By Jove, you are not so far wrong either," he said, "though the sneeze doesn't come into our family. But you have heard of the Marquis of Southshore, haven't you?" "Indeed," she answered. "I have seen his lordship in the house, and I was introduced to Lady Southshore at Cannes last season." "Then," said Delancey, "perhaps you will excuse me, and not have to sneeze, if I introduce myself as Richard Atherton Fitzgerald Delancey Epsworth, Viscount Brayley, son of the Marquis of Southshore. You all that? Said Miss Ransom, laughing as she clapped her hands delightedly. Just fancy, and I never thought of seeing a real, live English lord outside of the covers of the Illustrated London News, nor hear one talk except in a phonograph. But how churlish of me, she continued, with mock humility, yet with a winning humour that robbed her sarcasm of any bitterness. I ought to have replied, "Honoured by your condescension, my lord, I am just plain Mabel Ransom, daughter of Thomas Ransom, of Cleveland, Ohio, tobacco merchant." And then I should have curtsied, I suppose, though somehow my knees could never learn that supple bow of your English aristocracy. Delancey howled with laughter. "I'll have to correct you on 3 points," he said. "The first is that queens don't have to bow to their subjects, and you look every inch a queen or ought to be. The second—" Mabel cut him off, and there was a mischievous twinkle in her eyes as she said, "Your lordship is exceedingly kind. Couldn't you drop a hint to that effect the next time you and Georgie turn into that little saloon on the Strand for a mug of ale and a social chat? It might help me along." Lord Brayley, we will still call him Delancey, was not offended. Who, indeed, could take offence at the innocuous chatter of lovely Mabel Ransom, or try to suppress her bubbling humour? "Too late," he said with a smile. "Still, I might be able to do something else. There are various grades a trifle lower that are not to be despised." "But you interrupted my catalogue." "1,000 pardons, my lord, but you know a poor girl cannot afford to let a single opportunity slip. Your second point was that you should not deprecate the tobacco industry. I have, myself, smoked hundreds of Ransom cigars, and I never have smoked better. Any man ought to be proud of them. And my third point was that when you spoke of yourself as plain Mabel Ransom, you were entirely unfair to your mirror. Your lordship," Mabel replied, "is either over-kind or over-sentimental. But why must I regard all this as a secret? I am travelling incognito, you see. Viscount Brayley is supposed to be in Egypt. Even for the few months I remained in England, I was unknown to any but my nearest friends. This kind of thing, don't you know, gives a chap a chance to get a seat in the gallery and see the show, so to speak, instead of being always on the stage, where he can't see anything. And in Jamaica especially, where one of my ancestors nearly 300 years ago was governor, and where the family still owns large estates. I should be subjected to such a publicity that I should, or really try to hide myself, don't you know?" Mabel nodded. "I understand," she said simply, and glanced at her watch. "I know it," said Delancey hastily. "I know that I have kept you out too late, but I had to tell you this, and tonight is my last chance. We shall be in the harbour before daylight, and after that—" There was a question in his voice, but he did not finish the sentence. Mabel remained silent for a moment, then she said, partly in answer, "We shall be in the island for the winter. The doctor has advised Mother to spend the season in some warm climate, and Jamaica has been so highly recommended that we decided to try it. We have already secured rooms at the Constant Spring Hotel, where we shall remain for the next few weeks. After that, we shall probably go to some place in the country. Mandeville and the Santa Cruz Mountains have already been recommended, but we shall be better able to decide when we are there. Then it is not improbable that we shall meet," Delancey answered. "I shall be at Eihe Myrtle Bank Hotel for a fortnight at least. That is only 30 minutes from you on the trolley car. Would it be asking too much? Or for me to call and take you to see some of the sights and things, don't you know? I shall be really delighted, Mr. Delancey, that is, provided Mother keeps well enough to travel. Did you bring your car?" "I did not, Miss Ransom, but good automobiles and reliable chauffeurs can be hired here for little more than the cost of gasoline. If you need any assistance in that direction, I shall be, charmed to aid you, don't you know? Then it is only au revoir." she said, and held out her hand to him. He took it, but before he released it at the door of her stateroom, he raised it gently to his lips, and Mabel Ransom only smiled. 2. Kingston, Jamaica, at 7 o'clock on a lovely morning in early November. Quaintness, beauty, animation, vigor. That was what lay before Mabel Ransom, as with her mother on one arm, and Richard Delancey dancing an unencouraged, unrebuffed attendance at her other side. She stood on the deck of the Almirante. At the same pier, a United Fruit Company's freighter was loading bananas. Nearby, a big black steamer was taking on coal, and at the different wharves, a dozen other boats were receiving or discharging cargo. In front and on either side stretched the city, flat and picturesque to one who had last seen the skyscrapers of New York, yet distinctly pretty. From the contemplation of these, Mabel was called by her mother's voice. Then they went down the gangplank and faced the customs inspector. A taxicab sent from the hotel was awaiting them, and Delancey saw them into it. 9 o'clock, tomorrow morning, he reminded them, shook hands, turned on his heels, and was away. Next morning, the Englishman called up a well-known garage and hired a touring car and chauffeur for the day, and when he reached the Constant Spring, Mabel, dressed in summer muslins, her golden hair floating wavily in the soft morning air, stood waiting in the bright sunlight at the end of a magnificent arbor of bougainville, which stretched from the side entrance almost to the great door of the hotel itself. After that, Delancey was a regular visitor at the Constant Spring Hotel, and daily the little party went picnicking. One day it was to the Cane River Falls, another day to the matchless gardens at Castleton, or to the great dam and massive culverts at Bogwalk. One day they went slumming, and ended up with a visit to police headquarters, where they were shown most everything that could interest them, and obtained a lot of information. In the Rogues Gallery, Delancey spent some time. He looked through the large number of photographs carefully, and at length selected one for closer study. It bore the name James Orrery, alias Woodenhead Jimmy, with full description and address of that individual. "Tough-looking customer of yours," said Delancey to the detective who accompanied them. "Irish too, I see." "Yes, sir," answered the detective, "one of the thoroughly bad ones. Been in the pen 8 times already, and we are expecting him back most any day. Jimmy don't need no introduction in this here hotel no more. He's only to tap light on the door, and it's wide open to him." "Too bad," sighed Delancey. "What's his failing? Rum?" "Rum started him," replied the officer, "but now he doesn't stop at nowheres. He's broke 6 heads in this here town in one night, but his own is never scratched. That's why his pals say he is wooden-headed. His last visit here was when he was suspected of burglary less than a month ago. He was held for a few days, but there was no evidence against him, and the judge discharged him. For my part, I say, lock him up, evidence or no evidence. If he was not guilty, it was through no fault of his. I wouldn't give him no chance." "Don't you think his surroundings might have something to do with it?" said Delancey with a smile. "I see. He lives at 821 Rum Lane." "That's nothing whatever to do with it, sir, nothing at all," answered the policeman warmly. "I've known some perfectly honest people to live on Rum Lane, some total abstainers even, and you don't expect a man to be the devil because he lives near Hellgate, New York, or to be a thoroughly bad fish because his address is Rotten Row, London, do you? However, if Woodenhead Jimmy wishes to remove to Water Lane, which is only a couple of blocks off, or even to Church Street, nobody won't say nothing. But we'll keep an eye on him all the same." "The joke is on me," said Delancey with a laugh. "For a few years I lived on Rotten Row, but I must thank you for showing us around so kindly. I didn't think you had such an efficient police system out here, but I see you are nowhere behind us. Good day." The party emerged once more into Sutton Street, entered a taxicab, and was soon whisked away. And then the 9th of November came, and the great annual holiday. Delancey took the ladies to see the cricket match for the Island Championship at Sabina Park, and though they did not understand the intricacies of the play, they, nevertheless, caught the enthusiasm of the crowd. So that when, with 1 run to tie and 3 men to play, Barton had taken the ball and hammered down those 3 wickets without allowing his opponents that 1 run. They cheered themselves hoarse in the general uproar that followed. They did not know what had happened, but they knew that the great left-hander had achieved the improbable, and that was enough. Then they drove back to their hotel to prepare for the great ball that was to follow. Mabel's experiences that night were entirely new, and harsh with that pungency that intoxicates. Dressed in a light, clinging creation of sky-blue silk that threw out boldly the soft, creamy alabaster of her throat and shoulders, she wore on her breast a single crescent clasp, consisting of 1 large dei, amande, surrounded by an almost priceless cluster of the finest pearls. Yet these adornments were unnecessary, for the tender freshness of Mabel Ransom, the rosy lips and ruddier cheeks, and the bewitching, artless smile in her big brown eyes drew gallants to her as moths are drawn to a candle, but Mabel well knew the inconvenience of having her card filled too early. So she kept them off. She sat out the first march, and, when it was ended, had only 3 names on her card, and those were for the next 3 dances. Then she waltzed round the room to a tripping, airy, fantastic melody on the arms of Delancey, and followed up with a quadrille with the same partner, when their Viz was a young Negro legislator. Accompanied by Lady Berkshire, the governor's wife after that, she one-stepped with a gentleman who had been a passenger on the AIM route with her. And then she let herself go. 6 other dances passed off before Delancey and Mabel found themselves together once more. This time, it was in a wild, maddening gallop that sent the blood in a rush to their heads and faces, and intoxicated them with their own delirious exhilaration. They could not speak, save only with their eyes. They could hardly breathe, yet the gentle touch of the man on the slender form of the girl he held was the self-confident dominance of possession, and the sensitive intuition of the maiden telegraphed back a message of submission. As the music ended, and Delancey conducted her to her seat, he found time to whisper, "Won't you be sitting out a single dance? I had so wanted to have you to myself for a little while." "I am so happy, Mr. Delancey," she pleaded, "and my program is quite full. I could reserve only the last dance for you." "May I not? I must leave Kingston tomorrow for Westmoreland, at the other end of the island," he replied. "I waited only for this. I will see you after the last dance," she said hurriedly, for her next partner was approaching. "Is it a bargain?" "It's a favor," he answered, and yielded his place to the newcomer. 3. The Constant Spring Hotel stands on acres and acres of its own ground, an open meadow, decked here and there by straggling palms, or clusters of lilies, or little groves of carefully cultivated wild flowers hidden in the most unexpected nooks, and insidiously encouraged to assume their most natural wildness. As Richard Delancey led his companion out of the rapidly emptying ballroom, he readied her a light wrap from the adjoining coat room, and led her away out on the lawn, where a small rural seat, entwined with creepers, stood beside a towering black thatch. The crisp, dew-laden Bahama grass crunched musically beneath their feet, and the fragrance of jasmine filled the air they breathed, and added its intoxicating stimulus to their already overflowing hearts. The most serious moments are the moments when men find it hardest to put their thoughts into words. And so it was that these 2 young lovers, lovers of nature, lovers of life, lovers of each other, with their bubbling hearts, had to fence for an opening. "I hope you had a lovely time," was the inane remark he first made. "Delightful," she replied. "Why, it is altogether different from the old ball days. Is it something in the climate or in the place or the strangeness of it all that makes the difference? For you, it may be all that, he answered sentimentally. But for me, it is something in here. He laid his hand upon his bosom. That causes the change. Can you guess what it is? She looked up to him, and a fire of comprehension lighted her eyes. No, no, she cried. Do not tempt me. It is not fair. Heaven forbid that I should take any unfair advantage of circumstances, he answered. Is it dishonorable to tell you that you have bewitched me, that I see you in all my dreams, sleeping or waking, that I can think only of you? If I am cruel, I will unsay the words. From behind the distant long mountains, rising like a verdant island from the rolling plain that surrounded it, a sweet breath of rich sea breeze kissed her rosy cheeks and left them tingling. From the cold moon that shone overhead in all her splendor, or from the 1,000 brilliant stars around, a shower, as if of powdered glory, fell upon her countenance and left her a radiant, enchanted being. As she turned the tender young face up to his, as she laid one arm on his shoulder and whispered in the pure innocence of her noble young soul, "No, it is not fair, it is not manly, because, you know, Richard, that I love you, because you know I have fought against this for all these days, because you saw that the music tonight maddened me, and I had to fill up my program, had to give myself up to the wild abandon of recklessness in the hope of mastering myself. There," she added vehemently, "you have tempted me, and I have fallen. You have allowed me to say what no self-respecting woman should ever say. You have made me ashamed of myself. I wish I were dead." Delancey raised the delicate, shapely head that sobbed on his bosom and kissed the drawn lips lightly. "My darling," he said, "you have only said the words that any noble woman should say who desires to make a man happy." "But I have said them before I am asked," she said with a sigh. "No, no," he hurried. "My heart asked yours long, long ago, and only now it is answered, when my lips too had asked." For a long time the two sat silent and dreamed on. Then, suddenly, Delancey roused himself and spoke. "Will you go up now, dear, or would you like to sit here longer? I admit the spot seems charmed, and yet I feel that I must tear myself from you. But if you care to remain and drink in a little more of this sweet moonlight, to take in a few more mouthfuls of this invigorating sea breeze, to commune with nature and your own dear heart, I am sure there is no danger. The grounds are surrounded and watched, and the hotel is near. What will you do?" "I will go up," she said simply. "As you will, dearest. There is an old legend that maidens love to dream by moonlight at the spot where first they gave their heart, and that it is lucky. Don't you believe it?" "I never heard that before," she answered. "Do you believe in luck?" "In the concrete," replied Delancey enigmatically, "not in the abstract. Still, some remarkable things do happen. But I must get that next car." "I will see you to the car," she murmured. "Then I will go up." A short turn through the fields brought them to the street where the car stopped. Delancey wrung her hand and approached the waiting car. Then he stopped abruptly and turned to her. "You left your shawl where you sat," he said. "Shall I run to get it for you, or will you go for it? Luck, it seems, has decreed that you should return to the happy spot." The conductor watched the dialogue, then rang his bell. Trolley cars could not be kept waiting while young lovers made their lengthy adieus. "Catch your car," Mabel answered. "I will get my shawl." Delancey sprang to the footboard of the slowly moving vehicle and waved her a parting goodbye. Then she turned back toward the little rustic seat that had such tender memories for her. Mabel looked around where she had sat, but the wrap was nowhere to be seen. She stood dreamily eyeing the little bench, without, indeed, giving much thought to the lost article. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, a cold, firm hand grasped her neck and held her rigid. She tried to scream, but the vice-like grip tightened on her throat and prevented her uttering a sound. She fought and tore with the desperation of terror, but her frail strength was no match for the great thing that held her fast. She never saw it, for it held her face away. A great faintness overcame her, her struggles grew feebler, her eyes clouded, her senses grew confused, and she fell in a heap to the ground. And Mabel never knew more, never knew how, when all signs of life seemed gone, the cruel, steely grasp had passed from her throat and lifted her delicate body for one great final heave to the earth, where it had fallen, dishevelled and broken. For Mabel Ransom was gone, gone from the happiness she had anticipated, gone from the life she had but begun, gone from the pleasure she enjoyed, gone from the mother she idolized, gone from the world that had been all sunshine to her, gone. 4. The excitement in Kingston was of the most intense kind when, next morning, the papers made the startling announcement that the body of lovely Mabel Ransom, a guest at the Constant Spring Hotel, had early that morning been discovered on the grounds by a watchman. Owing to its delightful climate, one of the chief assets of the island is its tourist trade, and from a business as well as a natural instinct Jamaica prides itself, and justly, on its unstinted hospitality to foreigners. This painful tragedy, therefore, stung the nerves of all classes, and police headquarters well knew the force behind them, should there be any delay in hounding down the culprit. Inspector Cameron, with 3 of his best men, was himself on the job as soon as he received the first message of the murder. Peter Roger, a watchman employed by the hotel, had discovered the body of the murdered girl while making his usual rounds at about 3 o'clock in the morning. The dance had ended at 1:30. A porter had seen Miss Ransom leave the building with Delancey immediately after, but did not see them return. Delancey was found in his rooms at the Myrtle Bank. He was horror-stricken at the news. Yes, he had taken Miss Ransom for a moonlight ramble across the grounds after the ball, and had left her about 2:20 when she had accompanied him to the car. He did not mention her sentimental reason for returning. He would spare that much of the memory of the girl he had loved. Through the office of the traction company, Cameron was at length able to discover the car that had gone by the hotel at that time, and the conductor remembered and identified Delancey and the little girl in blue that had accompanied him when he boarded the car. The body of the dead girl was closely examined. It was bruised, and one arm was broken, but death had been caused, the doctors asserted, by strangulation. Her dress had been torn and soiled, and the jewel she had worn was gone. As this was roughly computed to be worth over $50,000, it was fair to assume that robbery was the only motive of the crime. The lawn of a much-frequented hotel was no place to look for footprints, and Cameron at once abandoned that idea. But he made a careful microscopic examination of the throat and dress of the dead girl for fingerprints. In this, however, he was disappointed. The murderer had apparently worn a thick, coarse glove, which, though it bruised and blackened the tender skin, if left no distinctive mark that could be traced. One only hope remained of finding the criminal. In a small place like Kingston, it would be difficult to dispose of a jewel of such value, and Cameron detailed a number of men to watch the jewelers, the pawn shops, and other places where such an article could be taken for dispossession. Nothing, however, was discovered. The quest struck a snag and was at a standstill. Delancey postponed his western trip and, with several other indefatigable amateurs, was giving all his time to the solution of the mystery. Yet no solution seemed in sight. 3 whole days had passed, and nothing had been achieved, and the public was clamoring for results. In this dilemma, Cameron had to fall back upon his last resort. Detective Sutherland was the big gun of the Bureau. At the present time he was engaged on an important case at Port Antonio, but his chief telegraphed him to drop everything else and report at once at headquarters. Before the great detective could arrive, however, a red-hot clue was in the hands of the detectives at Sutton Street. 5. Walter Armstrong was a young policeman, placed on active duty a couple of weeks before. Armstrong did not look like a policeman. He looked like a tramp who had lost his way in a public museum. But he had a pair of eyes. A good pair, and eyes are useful. Sometimes, even to a policeman. Armstrong was on beat in Lower King Street. He was standing in front of the Nova Scotia Bank, gazing dreamily at the small municipal park, as if trying to count how many flowers grew there, and entirely oblivious to the whirl of traffic that passed by. Suddenly, something flashed by his eye, as if out of the air. He woke up immediately, sprang to attention, and spun round on his heels, as the rule book said a good policeman should do. In another moment, he had detected whence the flash came, and he darted after a small, plainly dressed Negro girl who was walking briskly up the street. "Excuse me," B said, tapping her lightly on the arm. "You got to go with me up to Sutton Street." "What for?" cried the girl, startled. "I haven't done nothing. No questions asked and none answered," replied the limb of the law promptly. Then, remembering the rule book, added, "And I have to warn you that any statement you make will be used against you in evidence." "Well, but what I got to go for?" asked the puzzled girl. "'Cause I told you to," replied Armstrong, stretching out his great bulk. "And I'm an officer of the law. Will you go quietly now, or shall I arrest you?" The girl considered the situation for a moment, and then moved on beside her burly escort. "I will go," she sighed, "but I haven't done nothing." And at her throat the while, there sparkled a great crescent clasp, consisting of a single large diamond, surrounded by a collection of the rarest, richest pearls. At the station, Armstrong did not need to say a word. Half a dozen policemen sprang to welcome the pair and led them up to the lieutenant's desk. "What's your name?" asked that official. "Mary Berger." "But I haven't done nothing." "Address," continued the lieutenant, writing. She told him. "Now, Mary," said the lieutenant in a kindly, reassuring tone, "you will save yourself and us a lot of trouble if you answer frankly and truthfully a few questions I am going to ask you. Don't be afraid of anybody. We can protect you. Do you understand?" The girl nodded. "Tell me where you got that lovely brooch." "This. Why, I bought it with my own money." Armstrong, who was still standing beside the girl, tittered audibly. "Thank you, Armstrong," said the lieutenant. "I forgot to thank and compliment you. You may return to your post. I will see that this thing gets into my report." He turned again to the girl. "Will you tell me how much you paid for it?" he asked. 5 shillings, she replied proudly. "Why? Did he rob me?" "From whom did you buy it?" the lieutenant asked. "From a man I met in the street yesterday morning. He said he had picked it up, and when I paid him for it, he turned into the saloon at the corner of Charles and Duke Streets. Would you know that man if you saw him again?" "Can you describe him?" "I sure would. I paid him 5 shillings. He was about as tall as that man over there, but not so stout. He had a red face and a little moustache here, just a little. His face was wrinkled, oh, so wrinkled, and when he grinned, I noticed he had lost 2 teeth here." "Your information is very complete, Miss Berger," the officer replied, "and I thank you. I am sorry to have to ask you to leave the clasp with me and to wait for a few minutes just to identify the man. After that, we shan't trouble you." "And my 5 shillings?" asked the girl, surrendering the jewel. "I paid him 5 hard cash shillings for it, and I haven't done nothing." "We will see what can be done," he replied, and pressed a button. Then, to the man who answered, he simply said, "Burke, we want Woodenhead Jimmy on a hurry call." Exactly 15 minutes later, the habitual criminal was led into headquarters. Mary Berger identified him at once as the man who had sold her the clasp, and he did not deny it. Then the girl was allowed to go, and Inspector Cameron himself questioned the suspect. Jimmy admitted he had sold the girl the jewel, but said he had picked it up. When pressure had been brought to bear upon him, however, he said that he had not picked it up, but that a messenger boy whom he did not know had brought it to him in a small box a few days before. He could not remember what day it was. It was addressed to him, and inside was a paper with the words, "From a pal." He did not know who had sent it, and from this statement, no force could turn Jimmy. But a man who has served 8 different sentences in prison is hardly believed at police headquarters, even when his words seem true. And Jimmy's wild story could scarcely be believed if told by an honest man. "Jimmy," said Inspector Cameron with a sneer, "I wouldn't believe you if I knew you were telling me the truth." Then he turned to his attendants. "Very well, boys," he said, "take him away. It is the last time you will be troubled with Woodenhead Jimmy. If he had a partner in this game, it won T be hard to find him. But to me, it looks like a one-man job." The inspector breathed easily. The great mystery had been solved. The reputation of the force had been sustained. 6. Half an hour later, Detective Sutherland arrived at Sutton Street. "Well, old horse," the inspector greeted him, "for once you are too late. The mystery has been solved, and believe me, boy, you have been beaten to it by a mere greenhorn who has been in the service 3 weeks and who cannot find his way, unaided, through the streets of Kingston." "Who's the new marvel?" asked Sutherland. Loaded with honours himself, he could afford to welcome a rising star. "Young Armstrong," but there was no sleuthing, just plain luck. "And the culprit?" Sutherland asked. "Your old friend, Woodenhead Jimmy." The detective rolled his eyes about the room and finally fixed them on the inspector once more. "Believe me, Chief, I did not give Jimmy that much credit." Then he continued, "But since that is over, and I am not wanted, perhaps I could have the next few hours to do a little work on my own account." The inspector knew his man and knew the kind of work he would be likely to attend to. "By all means, Sutherland, by all means," he replied. "Take all the time you want. You know how much time you can spare off that Port Antonio case. I won't interfere." "Thanks, Inspector," said Sutherland, and swung on his heels. Early next morning, the detective was again with Cameron. "Inspector," he said, "as I wasn't in on that Constant Spring scoop, and as I learned that you were aided by several distinguished amateurs, and especially by a member of the British peerage, who is in the island incognito, I propose to give a little luncheon today at the Myrtle Bank Hotel to those gentlemen who signally assisted. It will help to get my name in the papers, you know." They both laughed. Then Sutherland explained his plans more fully. Next, he drove to the hotel and made arrangements with the manager. After that, he visited or telephoned his prospective guests, and everything was settled. Anthony Sutherland deserves more than a passing mention. He was a great big Negro, with a visage so round and regular that it was hard to perceive where his forehead ended, and his short, close-cropped hair began. His eyes were sleepy-looking, and his face wore an imbecile, idiotic expression. Looking at him, one wondered whether he could count 10. Minus a neck, his head sat awkwardly on one edge of his great circular body. At the opposite edge were 2 short, small legs that seemed wholly unequal to the 16 stone of meat and fat which Sutherland took with him wherever he went. It did not seem as if he could walk 5 yards in an hour, though there were many who would swear that they had seen him do a quarter-mile flat behind a fleeting burglar in considerably less than 2 minutes. But, then, Sutherland was the kind of man of whom nothing should be expected, yet of whom anything might be expected. And, at Sutton Street, he was invaluable. The luncheon at Myrtle Bank was a merry one. Inspector Cameron sat at the head of the table. At his right, Delancey, and at his left, Sutherland, faced each other. Below were half a dozen other guests who had interested themselves in the mystery. 6 bulky waiters, flat-footed and awkward, had served the different viands, cleared away the things, and just brought on the champagne with large beer glasses. "What is this new stunt you are trying to play on us?" Crowley, one of the guests, asked of the manager at the farther end of the table. I really didn't mind having to eat my ice with a butter knife, but I positively can't drink champagne from these mugs. "It puzzled me too at first," admitted the manager, "but now I seem to understand. Mr. Sutherland selected his own waiters, and I see the idea is to give us an extravagant burlesque, though he seems to be overdoing it." "We excuse him," said Cameron with a laugh. "Nobody could expect better of Sutherland anyhow." After the laugh had subsided, Delancey raised his glass and drank to the Jamaica police. Cameron rose to reply, but Sutherland pulled him back by the tail of his coat and rose in his stead. "Gentlemen," he said, "Inspector Cameron has permitted me to reply for him to the toast just proposed, and I beg to thank our distinguished visitor for his appreciation, as well as for assistance he voluntarily offered when we seemed confronted with a great mystery. I trust that before he leaves our shores, he may have further opportunity of seeing the ins and outs of our police system." "Sit down now, Sutherland," said one of the guests in a loud whisper. "You made a good start. If you go on, you will get your foot in your mouth." "I arranged for this party," continued Sutherland, "because I wanted to tell you something about the gem that has just been lost and recovered. Because, like other valuable stones, it too has a history. Several years ago, while I was in New York, the Jewelers Association held an exposition at the Grand Central Palace. Among the gems there exhibited was the great Sultana Crescent, kindly lent for the occasion by Colonel Ransom of Cleveland, Ohio. It happened that I was at that time employed as a porter in the Grand Central Palace, and had a good opportunity of observing the Crescent and of learning several interesting facts about it. Colonel Ransom himself did not know the intrinsic worth of the jewel, but that he fully appreciated its value may be gathered from the fact that before he would let it leave his safe, he had it insured for $75,000. Before the exposition had been half through, the insurance company wrote to cancel the policy, and the directors were in a quandary, for the colonel would not let it remain uninsured. And the directors knew that it was the central attraction of the show. At length, they struck upon the happy expedient of having it duplicated in paste. The job was done by a master of his profession, and none but an expert could tell the difference. I, however, as I say, had an opportunity of comparing the two, and of having the difference pointed out to me. For 2 days more, the crowds paid to see the imitation, not knowing that it was not the real Crescent. And then something happened. I was on watch that night with a young fellow named Mike Swanley. We were in a distant part of the building when we thought we heard some suspicious sounds and cautiously approaching. We found that a couple of masked burglars had opened the great safe that held the Crescent and other jewels. We threw ourselves upon them, and the fight was fast and furious. I had torn the mask from the man I confronted and had a good look at his face before a ball in my neck sent me to the floor. As I fell, however, I struck against the other burglar, who had downed Mike. I was able to send a ball through his head and to see Swanley rise from beneath him before I lost consciousness. Alas! When I recovered my senses, poor Mike was lying beside me, with a bullet through his heart, and a policeman was trying to shake life into me. One burglar was dead, but the other, the murderer of Mike Swanley, had escaped with his booty, a jewel of paste, worth a few shillings, as I have said. I had a good peek at the rascal who escaped, and I had little difficulty in identifying him in the rogues' gallery at police headquarters, New York. He was an old jailbird, originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and was registered as Billy Binks. The search for Binks throughout the United States was vigorous and persistent, but nothing more of him, nor of the paste Crescent, was ever heard. And often since I have consoled myself with the belief that he might have retired to his hole and died of some wound he received in that night's combat. And I was satisfied to think that the death of faithful Mike Swanley had been avenged, either by my hand or his own. Sutherland paused, and, raising the glass to his lips, slowly sipped a mouthful of wine. The little audience breathed, and uttered a murmur of approval. Sutherland raised his hand to stop them, then proceeded. In that, gentleman, I was deceived. The duplicate paste Crescent, lost that night in New York, turned up yesterday at the Sutton Street police station. It was found on a girl who bought it for 5 shillings. Its actual worth, from James Orrery, and unless I had intervened, Orrery, a thoroughly bad one, would swing for it. That means, gentlemen, that Billy Binks has still been after the Sultana Crescent since he discovered that Lai had only obtained a paste imitation and followed Miss Ransom to Jamaica. And I'll tell you another secret, gentlemen. Ah, must you go already, Lord Brayley? I mean, Mr. Delancey? Just a little joke before you leave. See those waiters? I selected them myself. They all wear uniforms when they are at police headquarters. I gave them a little signal a minute ago, and if you will look closely at them, you will see that 4 of them are covering you with pistols, though the weapons are covered with napkins. And they are good shots, Viscount Brayley. Remarkably good shots. Better not try it. Yes, Billy Binks. Sutherland ground out between his teeth while fire flashed from his eyes. We meet today under circumstances entirely different from those in New York that last time, when you murdered poor Mike Swanley, and nearly did for me. But when you distinctly drew attention to yourself and Miss Ransom before you entered the car that night to get off at the next corner. Then hurry back to murder her, when you sent the paste Crescent by a hired boy to Orrery, where you knew it would be traced, but whose explanations, as a habitual criminal, you knew would not be accepted. You laughed up your sleeves at the island police. Yet it was a defiance, Mr. Binks, that I, swum to avenge Mike Swanley, could never pass. And lastly, gentlemen, added Sutherland, pulling a package from his pocket and turning again to his little audience, while 2 of the waiters safely manacled Delancey, take a look at the 2 Sultana Crescents, the genuine and the false. This is the duplicate. It was taken from Mary Berger and is probably worth 5 shillings. And this is the genuine Crescent. It was taken from Mr. Delancey's rooms upstairs while we sat at luncheon here and brought me by a waiter. Colonel Ransom valued it at $75,000, and the best judges consider his estimate extremely conservative. End of The Sultana Crescent by Wiliam F. Vassall.